the High selection. And on behalf of myself and all the staff at the High and the Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you to our lecture this afternoon by Professor Katherine Hauser from Skidmore College. And Katie, thank you for joining us this afternoon. A couple of things before we get started. We are videotaping the lecture, so please make sure your cell phones are silenced. And we're going to have questions and answers for Professor Hauser once her lecture is completed, okay? Great. And there goes the cell phone. All right, that worked. Thank you. Today's lecture we are holding in connection with the exhibition in the Hooks Gallery, Audrey Flack Heroine, which is on view until January 3rd. Of course, I hope you all stay to look at the show. Perhaps after Professor Hauser's lecture today, you'll be inspired to go back and take a second look. And please be sure to tell your friends and family to come to the High. And it's a great opportunity to see the work of a very important and pioneering photorealist artist of the 20th century who is still active today. I'd like to say that Audrey Flack is 84 years young. She has a ton of energy. She was here at the High in late September, and I've spent a lot of time with Audrey. I've had many conversations with her on the phone about the exhibition, and she's just full of life and energy. She's as vital as ever, still producing important work. And Audrey Flack Heroines is an exhibition of her recent work. It's work created in the last 4 years. She was an artist in residence at Lafayette College at the Experimental Printmaking Institute there, and the suite of drawings and prints is a result of this collaboration with the Experimental Printmaking Institute at Lafayette College. We are celebrating heroes and heroines this fall at the High. Audrey Flack's exhibition, today's lecture, and I hope you will join us on Sunday, November 15th at 2 p.m. We're going to host author and teacher Matthew Roselle for a special Veterans Day presentation. Mr. Roselle will discuss his new book, The Things Our Fathers Saw, and the lecture will be followed by a book signing. This is being organized, this lecture in particular, is being organized in partnership with Glenn Symphony Orchestra's Salute to Heroes series. Now on to introducing today's speaker. Katherine Hauser is an associate professor of art history at Skidmore College. She received her BA in art history from the University of California at Davis, an MA and PhD from UCLA, all in the history of art. Since 1997, she's been teaching in Skidmore, and she has taught classes on modern and contemporary art history, as well as the histories of photography and design, and women in art. Her particular area of specialty is 20th century representational art. She's been honored by Skidmore for excellence in teaching. Her essays have appeared in GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, Women's Art Journal, and Women in Language, among many other publications. Her essay on Audrey Flack, entitled Audrey Flack Still Lifes Between Femininity and Feminism, appeared in the Women's Art Journal. Her lecture today, Art is a Feminist Issue, explores Audrey Flack in the context of the feminist art movement, which is a very intriguing topic given what's been written on this subject over the past 30 years. So I applaud Professor Hauser for her work in this area and that very excellent essay, if I might add. Audrey Flack has actually mentioned Katie Hauser to me several times, and she greatly admires her writings and her thinking on her own work. So Katie, I want to share a big hello from Audrey today. She does wish she could be here, so we're videotaping it for Audrey so she can watch it later. Like I said, we're going to have questions, Professor Hauser, at the end. And without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for Katherine Hauser.
Thank you, Erin, and also everybody here at the High. And thank you so much for coming on this gorgeous fall day. I did interview Audrey Flack over 20 20-some years ago, 25 years ago, something like that, for my dissertation. And she was such a character then, and I'm sure she still is a character now. Just amazing amount of energy, just incredible. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about Audrey Flack's work today in the larger context of feminism and the contemporary art world. And people in the back, David, you can hear me okay? Should be louder? It's all right? Okay. So what I plan to do is to, and there she is, she's born in 1931, sketch out a brief outline here of my path through the talk, which is why critics generally don't consider Audrey Flack a key feminist artist, and then I'm going to offer some reasons why I think we may. And along the way, hopefully, you will all learn something about feminism, contemporary art, and also Audrey Flack's work in particular. So my title, Art as a Feminist Issue, comes, of course, from Susie Orbach's famous book from 1978, which is Fat as a Feminist Issue. And in the book, the author explores women's difficult relationships with their bodies and eating, compulsive eating in particular. So in the context of the 1970s and the women's liberation movement, and also what female artists were doing, this book fits into a sustained interest in women's bodies as part of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s. And so that would include establishing women's rights to have an abortion, for example, to have control over their own bodies, or artwork that we see here, Ana Mendietta's work, which celebrates women's bodies and their sexuality. And we see here Mendietta's nude body pressed up against a tree, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So if we look at Audrey Flack's works from the 70s, we'll see that it's not focusing on the female body. So if this work was considered exemplary of feminist art in the 70s, which it was, this is what Audrey Flack was doing in the 70s. So she was making these fairly large paintings, photorealist paintings, that don't show the female body. Their closest connection to the female body would be they often have lots of things that women put on their bodies, like makeup and jewelry. If we look at her work from the 80s, then we do see she's made a major shift into a different medium, to working with sculpture, and she's also, of course, now focusing on the female body. This is her Islandia Goddess of the Healing Waters from 1988. Dramatic shift, I think you can see. Okay, so now she is focusing on the female body. The problem is that feminist art in the 80s wasn't focusing on the female body anymore. So you have work like Barbara Kruger's from 1982, which addresses how expectations for feminine behavior are formed. And so she was taking advertisements from magazines geared towards women, and then including text on them with things like what we see here, your gaze hits the side of my face, drawing attention to how looking at women and women thinking about being looked at encourages them to behave and appear in certain ways. And in this piece in particular, maybe resisting that kind of objectification that we would see in the media. All right, so what we have in the 70s is work on the body, but not Audrey Flack. And then we have Audrey Flack's work on the body, but not feminist artists in the 80s. All right, so I think this probably helps to illustrate why she's not considered an important feminist artist, and I think at best she's rather sidelined as a feminist artist. So even though the promotional material for the show, Audrey Flack Heroines, refers to her feminist imagery from the 70s and presumably later, Flack actually probably wouldn't be considered a feminist artist by most art historians and critics. So if I was teaching a class on feminist art and I had 1 or 2 class sessions to address contemporary feminist art, I wouldn't talk about Audrey Flack, even though I publish on her. And because I would be considered to be doing a disservice to my students because I would be giving them sort of canonical figures in feminist art. All right, so she's considered peripheral at best. So I will be exploring more in more detail why this art, which is all about women, is only marginally considered feminist. I'll also be offering offering some interpretations of her art, and as I contextualize it, you will also see other art that's considered to be more conventionally feminist, although putting conventionally and feminist in the same sentence seems sort of wrong, because feminism is all about breaking conventions. But it's fair to ask them, what do we mean when we talk about feminism or feminist work, or feminist approach to art making? So it's not enough to just have women be your subject, obviously, to be a feminist work. So Tom Wesselman, I think, would hopefully, obviously, not be a feminist work for everybody in the audience, even though it is also obviously all about women. So that wouldn't be sufficient. One feminist approach that I could take would actually not really consider the content of Audrey Flack's work. It might consider her place in the art market. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worth pointing out, in general, women's marginal status in the contemporary art market. So you're seeing a bubble information graphic here, all the men and then all the women, and there aren't very many women. And this is from 2008 to 11, this charts the top 278 artworks sold, top in terms of value, in terms of which artworks are the most valuable, and in that 270 works, there were 3 by women. So 267 of those top earning works are by men. All right, so why then are prices for women so low? Obviously, this graphic helps illustrate that. They often lack access into the art world, and even before we start talking about dealers, they lack access into the art world. I'll just start at the dealer level. And so this is a graphic that the Guerrilla Girls, who are a feminist art collective, who are still working, but really made their name in the 80s, with gathering statistics like the ones you see here. So where they looked at all the artists represented by these dealers and found that they showed no more than 10% of women artists, or none. And these are major art dealers. Mary Boone would be a really big dealer. Dia Art Foundation would be helping to establish careers. Leo Castelli, a little bit dated, but still important. Marion Goodman, Barbara, these are the big deal galleries. All right, so they've updated this to 2014, just last year. Well, now we've got up to 20% in like 20 years. So you can see that not a whole lot of progress has been made. So women still aren't getting into the dealer critic system. They're still not being represented by dealers. So why does that matter? Well, in order to get into shows like the Whitney Biennial and Annual, and this tracks them, you need to have some visibility. And to have visibility, you have to have a dealer who's making a case for you. And so we can see here the light blue are the men, and then the lightest light blue are women, which you can't really see on this, I think with this lighting. I don't know if it could be a little darker, is that possible? And then the gray would be the collectives. And so I think you can see, certainly from the male, this chart here, that they had almost 100% of those artists shown in the Whitney Biennials, for example, in 1969, were men in painting. And as we get to 2014, we have about 60-some% of the artists shown in the Whitney Biennial are men. So it's getting better, but it still is by no means reaching any kind of parity. And the solo exhibitions, if you can't get into a group exhibition, then you really can't have a solo exhibition. So at every level, we're seeing impediments for women to kind of make it in the art market. And so here, again, you see very light. It's so light as to almost be invisible, which is emblematic of women's presence. So here's women, here are women, here are women. I had higher hopes for LACMA. It's on the West Coast. I would have thought they would have done better. Here's women, the Whitney, here's women, the MoMA. So the solo exhibitions of women artists then are still depressingly low. This is 2007 to 14. So it's very recent. And if you can't have solo shows, then your works don't get to be taken really seriously and then be included in the permanent exhibition displays at MoMA. So those works that when you go in the galleries that are always on show. So what we have are percentage females. This is the females down here, 2013. So close to 90-some% of the works that are on permanent exhibition at MoMA are by men. And so I've hopefully charted this development where women don't have access, even at the earliest levels, they can never catch up and kind of get to have that kind of status. So just in general, the status for women in the art market is pretty awful. So where does Audrey Flack, oh, and that's how we get to this. That's how we end up here, because if their works are not in the permanent display at MoMA, then they're not considered as valuable. And so that is reflected in the art market and auction houses. So how does Audrey Flack fit into this? Well, unfortunately, she's a very minor player in the scheme of contemporary art at auction. And the art market is not a judge of quality. I would say that. That has nothing to do with quality necessarily. So the fact that she's not a major player in the art market says nothing about the quality of her work. So in 2012, this painting, World War II Vanitas, which is a photorealist work, sold for about $87,000. Richard Estes, a fellow photorealist, sold his Seagram building in 2011 for $123,000. So it was sold for more, but you might say, well, that's not that much more, so maybe she's not doing that badly. But one of the ways that art is priced is by size. The bigger it is, the more it costs. And so I tried to approximately put the size of this one compared to the size of this one in real life. I'm sure that's not totally accurate. But this is 7.5 feet square, and this is 1.5 by 2 feet. It's a small piece. So if you think about acreage, then her work is really not earning parity with male artists that are being sold at auction, male photorealists. So one feminist approach then might be to look at how the art market treats work by male and female artists. And we're lucky, I'll just go back, we're really lucky. Art News did this study. It came out just a few months ago and published this information in their magazine. It's a glossy magazine that collectors and dealers and museum professionals would read. So we're really fortunate to have this recent statistical information, and I think it's worth getting it out there so people see what the results are. Okay, so one approach would be to look at the art market, and I think that that's really important, and clearly things aren't going well for contemporary female artists, but it's more interesting for us here today to look at the content of Audrey Flack's work, as well as her mediums to figure out, as I have in my notes, why she's basically been dissed as a feminist artist. So we'll start with one of her works, Chanel, her photorealist works. So these were the groundbreaking works that made her famous, as Erin was saying, the photorealist paintings. And photorealist canvases, as you see here, were paintings that looked more or less photographic, the way the artist painted them. There's a group of about 8 to 10 artists who are lumped in as photorealists. They're working in the late 60s into the mid-70s. They're not a cohesive group, they just all happen to be working in that mode at the same time. And I should say, in the print show here, the other show, there's Estes and I think a Cunningham photorealist print. So you can see there's a couple of photorealist prints in the show. There's not really Audrey Flack photorealist piece per se, but there are in the other show. So, and here's another example by Richard Estes, who's also one of the central figures in this movement. So just being a photorealist was a problem. So trying to figure out why Audrey Flack's work hasn't been taken seriously, one place we can start is just with the mode in which she's painting. Because photorealism wasn't considered to be a very serious art form at the time by the critics. So she's sort of already behind. So here are what some of the critics wrote about photorealism. Well, it's an example of simian mimesis, so they're just copying like monkeys, what they see. Cynical sellout to popular taste. Bizarre, rather naive continuation of pop art. Well, none of those things are very good. I think we can all agree. So just being a photorealist, that just sort of put her back, because critics didn't take the movement seriously. The public loved the movement, of course, right? It was very popular where people wanted to buy art. I think they really enjoyed the pieces in part because of the skill that these works showed. Incredible skill by the artists. And the other art that's popular at this time would be, for example, conceptual artworks that might not have anything at all, like an object. or they might be just some painted stripes or something like that. So seeing artists who are so skillful in their paintings, a lot of the people who collected art felt like they were really getting something for their money. They were getting clear skill in the work that they saw. And it was also fairly easily understood. Still lifes, as you see here, and also landscape paintings. So those were the kinds of forms that buyers could understand. So the buyers understood them, the critics didn't like them, they thought they were just copying photographs, so they didn't take it very seriously. All right, so I think we should put those prejudices aside and think about the medium and the process. Although I do want you to keep it in the back of your mind because it helps explain why Audrey Flack's work wasn't then taken very seriously by critics, which is already sort of starting from a deficit. All right, so the photorealist works that she made, she did a lot of still life paintings like we see here with Chanel. And they do all seem to be, or many of them seem to be sort of all about women and focused on women's lives. As you see here, as I said before, these still life paintings often contain things that women might put on, eye makeup, or nail polish, lipstick, more nail polish, and of course perfume, the Chanel perfume for which the piece is named. Also jewelry that women would wear. She painted her work. This was another reason that really put her back. Oftentimes she used airbrush. She's like, oh my God, who uses airbrush? People who paint cars. I mean, artists don't use airbrush. So that was another reason that helped minimize her impact in the art world. She would take photographs and then project those photographs as a transparency on the wall and then paint over the transparency. This is how she made a number of her works. So when they look like they have these soft kinds of edges, a lot of that would come from the airbrush kind of technique. All right, so these are all about women. Why don't these count as feminist artworks? I think one of the problems with these paintings is to do with their photographic appearance, so that I think they look too close to the advertisements for cosmetics. So I have an Avon ad here from about the time period a little bit earlier, but she was born in 31, so 1959, she's already in her late 20s, would be familiar with this kind of advertising. So the problem would be is that Flack didn't transform these ads enough. Even though she's not explicitly working from advertising, she's making her own still life paintings, but I think any of us could see the similarity between the two, and I'll point those out in more detail. So if you take away the woman and the bottom men, you end up with a still life that's spread out here that's quite similar to what we see in Audrey Flack's paintings. And we'll see in her Jolie Madon painting also roses that will come up. We have makeup or perfume that's laid out on a horizontal plane, much like we see with Audrey Flack's work. This is a UK product, Rimmel, UK beauty product. And if we isolate the cosmetics in this ad, we can see how similar these two images really are. The similar kind of use of eyeshadow, semi-open eyeshadow here. We have compacts and also the similar shiny bluish hue to the surface. This, I think, is mylar. That's the surface that she used here. And here it looks like they're using a kind of satin kind of fabric, but they both end up having the same kind of effect. This is for other painting I mentioned, Jolie Madon, another photorealist still life painting. We have fruit and a rose, a flower with jewelry, ring, necklaces, bracelets, and then we also have the perfume that we see here, Jolie Madon perfume, along with other still life kinds of objects, which I'll come back to. So here we have a flower and other kinds of, especially the perfume that's laid out here, as it is, as you see here. Here's another 52, an Avon ad, which has a similar reddish hue. And if you isolate that, you see the flower over here, much in the same way as the flower in Audrey Flack's painting. And again, similar kinds of feminine objects laid out on this horizontal plane. All right, so sorry, I'll come back to that in just a second. So if then the paintings do look like advertisements, which I think they do, then you can see why they might be seen as maybe even anti-feminist kinds of works. For feminists in the 60s and 70s, cosmetics suggested that there's something wrong with you the way you were. So advertising for cosmetics meant that you had to put on makeup to make yourself look better than you did without makeup. And so that seemed to be a pretty sexist message. So the idea that you had to supplement your looks with something that you bought to make yourself acceptable was deeply anathema to many feminists at the time. It was also one of the most divisive issues. Some feminists say that the thing that really broke feminists apart was not abortion but lipstick. And so here, Susan Bramwell says, an unadorned face became the honorable new look of feminism in the early 70s, and no one was happier with the freedom not to wear makeup than I. Yet it could hardly escape my attention that more women supported the Equal Rights Amendment and legal abortion than could walk out of the house without eyeshadow. Did I think of them as somewhat pitiable? Yes, I did. Did they bitterly resent the righteous pressure put on them to look, in their terms, less attractive? Yes, they did. A more complete breakdown and confusion of aims, goals, and values could not have occurred, and of all the movement rips I've witnessed, this one remains for me the most poignant and the most difficult to resolve. This is all about lipstick. I mean, this was it, you know. So when we see these cosmetics, they're not innocent kinds of objects for any women at the time. And a feminist critic could look at Audrey Flack's still life painting and think, what are you doing? You're just promoting cosmetics and makeup. There are these glossy paintings, they just look like the advertisements. If anything, this is anti-feminist kind of work. All right, so we can see then that Audrey Flack's work suffers from being associated with photorealism, and we can also see that it's going to suffer by being associated with advertising for cosmetics. So there's two layers and two ways in which the paintings don't really fit with what feminist critics were looking for at the time. So there were feminist artists who were working with cosmetics, but they seem to be doing so in a way that's far more critical of cosmetics than what Audrey Flack was doing. So here's a piece by Lynn Hirschman. Lynn Hirschman created a persona called Roberta Brightmore. She existed for about 10 years or so, and she had her own driver's license. This is like late 70s when you could presumably get a driver's license in a persona that was not your own. I mean, I don't think you can get away with that now. She had her own credit cards. She had her own therapist. So Roberta Brightmore was a person in a performance that Lynn Hirschman undertook. And there's lots of documents documenting her performance, but one of the documents here is constructing Roberta Brightmore using cosmetics, and here she is, made up, and here's a chart of how to use the cosmetics. And the instructions say things like lighten with Dior, eye stick light, peach blush, brown contour makeup by Coty, and all of the, it's almost like a paint by numbers kind of painting, right? And clearly it sort of makes fun of, I think, probably all the women in here have seen those self-help illustrations in magazines that show you how you should apply your makeup, how to make your eyes look smoky, you know, something like that, right? And so you have to layer the makeup in certain ways. So I think this is a parody of those kinds of texts that women are overly familiar with. So the end result is sort of uncomfortable. It's a little sort of monstrous, I think. I don't think what we see here is a particularly attractive female. So what we get is a kind of dismissal of cosmetics or a critical look at them. Another example of artists working with cosmetics was this lipstick bathroom that was part of the installation Woman House, which was an installation was a house that a bunch of female art students took over in Los Angeles before it was condemned, and they were able to reconfigure the rooms in any way they liked. And so one of the rooms that they took on was the bathroom, and this is how they rendered it. They painted everything in a kind of vivid red lipstick kind of color. And the idea here, of course, is that there's just so much of this red that it seems kind of menacing in the sort of total saturation of the color. And also at the time, really, in a sort of brand new way, we have artworks that are starting to address domestic violence, references to blood in the domestic sphere and in the home. This is really brand new in the 70s, and we can thank these artists for bringing up these issues in their work, for us being able to talk about it now. So that's not what her work is doing. I think that that's pretty clear. All right, so then in the early 80s, Flack mostly stops painting to focus on sculpture. So she leaves behind much of the still life work that she had been painting for over a decade. And so now she starts focusing on the female body almost exclusively. And it's often a mythical or a goddess-like female body, as we see here in Mylandia. So in sculptures like these, we see idealized female bodies. They often take a really active kind of stance. As you see here, she's striding forward on her right leg, and she's holding up her arms in gestures. The idealized body, in that she's, I would say, a fairly attractive, kind of fit, healthy sort of body, idealized in that way. And in this case, she has a gilded face. And a lot of her goddess statues, they get to wear like crowns and tiaras and things like that we see here. Okay, so there are, and it's also colorfully painted and gilded, I should say that. That's where the polychrome comes in. So there were feminist artists in the 70s who were working with goddess themes, and they were fairly well respected in the 70s. But what they did with the subject matter was really different from what Flack does in the 80s. So they're not nearly as traditional in their sculpting methods. So Betsy Damon, for example, she's inspired by an ancient, many-breasted goddess. Here she is. And here's a Greek representation of that ancient goddess, just so you can get a sense of what the votive figures looked like. So Betsy Damon then, she paints herself white, and she overlays herself with bags that are filled with flowers. Some of these bags are colored flowers, some are just white flour. And then she stands in a sort of sacred space that's been marked by the circle here on the ground. And she would sort of walk around ritualistically in circles, and then she would break open. You can see some of the broken open flour here. Or she would give the bags of flowers to other people. So she's trying to perform in a public space and in a way that completely disrupts the expected role of women to behave appropriately. This is not appropriate female behavior, of course. And she's doing it by calling upon a kind of ancient goddess figure for strength, which would be this many-breasted, votive kind of deity. Anna Mendieta, I showed her work at the beginning, and in this piece she presses her mud-covered naked body against a tree. Here she's trying to rely on a kind of divine association with a female nude body, and then link that with the divine associations of a powerful natural force, which would be the earth, nature, the natural world. So in works like these, she uses her own body that are in documented performances, so this would be a photograph of a performance, in ways that disrupt the conventions of the beautiful female body. Right? She turns it into something sort of grotesque, kind of mysterious, potentially powerful. So these kinds of feminist pieces then, that in the 70s that were drawing attention to the female body, and also referring to kind of goddess, I can talk about goddess stuff, but goddess themes might be a better way of putting at it. They were arguing that there's something special about the female body. And this is a particular kind of feminism that's called essentialism. And the argument here is that there are innate or essential characteristics that the sexes have that separate them, that make us who we are. And so for women, then that would mean that the artist would focus on things like breasts, as we saw with Damon's work, or genitalia, or reproductive organs. These are the things that distinguish women from men. These are the things that make women special and make them have a kind of power. So Chicago's dinner party is a classic example of this. It's often used to demonstrate this interest in female genitalia. At the time, it's called central core imagery. It's a large installation. Now it's in the Brooklyn Museum. It finally found a permanent home a number of years ago, so if you're at the Brooklyn Museum, go see it. It's got 39 place settings of mythical and historic women. And the central core imagery is this vaguely sort of vaginal iconology that you see in the plates. There's nothing explicit. It's always abstracted, but the idea is that it does refer to female genitals. And this work also combines, as focus on the body, what makes women special, with linking that to the goddesses. So this is the fertile goddess. That's the place setting for the fertile goddess. So here you see that interlinking of the female body with the goddess theme. So we see here that Damon's and Mendietta's work also focuses on the female body with the breasts, or the kind of nude body in Mendietta's case, also drawing attention to her breasts, and linking those with goddess-like kinds of powers. This is not the same as liberal feminism, or we might say, equal rights kind of feminism. This is different from that. So the essentialist feminism is highlighting what makes women different and special. Liberal feminism, this kind of feminism, does not take that approach. Essentialist feminists want to celebrate women for being special. On the other hand, the liberal feminists want women to be equal. Okay, so the essentialist feminists would say, well, equal to what or whom? Why should we set up men as a standard and argue that we're equal to men? Why don't we celebrate what makes us special and distinctive? And this kind of feminism has some very concrete effects and material outcomes. So, for example, in places like Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, women get menstrual leaves from work. They get either unpaid or paid days off when they get their periods. And that's because men don't get their periods. When women get their periods, they should get some days off to deal with it. So that would be the consequences of the kind of essentialist feminism. So we're special. Most of our working lives, we have our periods. Instead of pretending that we don't, that we're like men who don't, why don't we emphasize that we do and get the special treatment that we deserve? Okay, so that's a feminist approach that's based on difference. It's what makes women different from men. All right, and that's the kind of feminism that we see at play in this kind of work that I've been talking about that highlights the female body. But by the 80s, this kind of female body, goddess, essentialist art is out of favor. That's why there's that big red slash through it. So even critics who 10 years prior had endorsed and celebrated body, goddess-oriented art turned around in the 80s and disapproved of it. So these are some of the reasons that they gave for disapproving of goddess and feminist work. All right, so one argument would be is really what makes us female are kind of the things that make us feminine. And those are cultural conventions like long hair, high heels, or lipstick. So those are not things that are essential to us, those are things that we sort of put on. And instead we should think about how we know how we should behave, how do we learn how to behave like women, and then we should be paying attention to things like advertising, film, and the media, like Barbara Kruger's work did. Even if we wanted to locate feminism and what makes the female body special, for many theorists in the 80s, it just seemed so reductive. I mean, they would say, surely we're more than our genitals and our reproductive organs. And there's also a problem linking those female bodies with this kind of mystical goddess spiritualism. For many of the critics in the 80s, that seemed to reverse the mystical god-like male figures who are all powerful with mystical goddess-like figures who are all powerful. So that didn't actually address the issue of power, which might be what feminists should be paying attention to. It just reversed the terms. So in the 80s, then, feminists are disavowing the goddess stuff because it seemed potentially anti-intellectual and it could undermine gains that they had made in the academy. So this is the time when Audrey Flack starts doing her goddess work, is in the 80s, right? And it's like, no, I mean, the critics are just not taking this seriously. So in terms of timing, she's doing this work at the worst possible time. Maybe the work would have been accepted and considered serious in the 70s. By the 80s and the 90s, nobody's really taking this kind of work that's based on the idea of women's difference seriously, or this idea of a mystical goddess power. These ideas are considered passé. And here's another piece of hers. This is the Islandia piece, and this is Egyptian rocket goddess. Again, tying into ideas of ancient kind of goddesshood. Furthermore, I think you can see how conventional her works appear to be compared to the works that I showed you, which these are based on performance. This is a large installation. It uses craft materials. Instead, we have sort of high art references here, kind of plasticizing sculptural monuments. So I think it's easy to see how this work doesn't seem very challenging to patriarchy. You have a conventional artistic process. as combined with the aesthetically appealing female body, those things would seem fundamentally conventional, if not potentially sexist, I have in my notes, in how they represent an idealized, youthful, nude body. Maybe anti-feminist, if not sexist. All right, so I made a case then for her paintings looking just like cosmetic, advertising, and so urging women to wear makeup because they're not good enough looking without it. Sorry about that. I made a case for her sculptures as being retrograde and sexist. Okay, but I'm going to flip that around. And I think it's worth applying the ideas that made the goddess work of the 70s seem powerful at that moment to Flack's later works. And there's a historical reason for that. So in part, we've made tremendous gains for women in the last 20, 25 years, although women still make quite a bit less than men, right, in terms of to the dollar. But one way that I think you could make a case that we're slipping back is women's rights over their bodies. So in terms of abortion, legalized in 1973, but since then we've seen a lot of what's called chipping away at abortion rights. For example, the partial birth abortion ban in 2007, which the Supreme Court upheld. And then we know in lots of states have instituted waiting periods, counseling, they specify gestational terms. There was an attempt by North Dakota to limit it at 6 weeks. I don't know if you even know you're pregnant at 6 weeks. Stringent requirements regarding physician and hospital requirements, etc. So we've seen this movement to kind of exert control back over the female body. So when we have Audrey Flack making works like this that sort of celebrate the female body, I think we can look to see what made those 70s works so compelling. And so people valued those works because they invoked the goddess very intentionally as a way to condemn sexism and misogyny that was associated with female bodies. They were trying to get to some pre-classicizing reference of votive figures, goddesses, and that would skirt the whole sort of patriarchal system. So there's a worth there in that kind of project. They were often sexual, and we see, I think, her statues are quite sensual, if not sexual. And that was part of a strategy to position female sexuality as not something dirty or only for male consumption, right? To try to take back the power over one's body. Aligning the female body with nature, as she does here, goddess of the healing waters, could be seen as an attempt that challenges Judeo-Christian belief systems, which, that's not going to fly. And also value systems where the Enlightenment ideas that dominate, the privilege, the mind over the body. Well, a goddess of healing waters definitely challenges that. So by creating this kind of magnificent statue that pairs the female body with the natural force and power of water, then perhaps the sculpture challenges conventional belief systems that might belittle both nature and the female body. I think we can look at specific Black goddess works to see that there is a kind of feminist reworking of Enlightenment precedents. So this is her sculpture Medusa, which is only 10 inches high, but I think it's easy to imagine it's like 10 feet tall. And so she's updates here the representation of the goddess. She suffered a beheading at the hands of Perseus. And here is Cellini's Perseus, who's beheaded Medusa from 1550. And Medusa looks rather calm. And here's Canova's Perseus from about 1800. And she looks slightly worried, maybe. I'm not sure if he was that. Okay. So she's angry. This Medusa is angry. I think she's a suffering, outraged figure. And this seems to be a much more appropriate response to a beheading. Her mouth is open, her eyes are wide open, she's either shrieking or yelling in pain or anger. Her hair is all alive and also is, hissing in dismay. So it's much more in line with the ancient Medusa representations in ancient Greek or Roman context, where she does look at least worried, even if she isn't sort of making outrageous kinds of faces. So I think that here she's outraged as she should be. So I think that we can see a kind of feminist content even in some of Flack's works. What Flack has been able to do that Essentialist artists in the 70s could not is to make large-scale permanent public monuments, and that's really been a part of her recent work. So this is a project that was completed in Rock Hill, South Carolina. It was commissioned by the Economic Development Council, and it's an intersection. There are 4 statues, and then there are these huge columns behind them. The statues are what Audrey Flack made for this large intersection. It's apparently very hard to get a shot of all of them. So this is 2 of them at night. And then I have some details of them. The statues themselves are all the same. The female bodies are all the same. But they hold different sort of icons. And the 3 here are lightning for energy and fire, and the stars for the celestial world. And the other one is industry. So we've got the natural world, the power of the natural world here, found in this sort of fire and stars and lightning, combined with these idealized female bodies. They're 20 feet tall with a base. So I think these are kinds of dramatic and powerful and permanent statements that celebrate the female body and link her powers to the natural world. Okay, so I've explained why her photorealist paintings would not be considered feminist.